Welcome to my presentation on using young adult fiction for social justice in the English classroom. This presentation was originally given at the 2014 Ncte National Convention in Washington, D.C. My thesis for this presentation is that young adult books can create engagement and accessibility with content students would also encounter in canonical works, and that they can augment the curriculum by bringing in diverse voices and perspectives that better reflect the modern classroom. One of the challenges of using canonical literature in the modern classroom is that it can sometimes act as a gatekeeper to literacy rather than a pathway to it. And this is because of three areas: relevance, accessibility, and engagement. When I'm talking about relevance, what I mean is that students need to see themselves in the text to begin to see themselves as readers. Classics make it difficult for students to build membership into the community of readers and writers because they don't always recognize themselves in the text that they're presented with. Another issue here is accessibility, and I'm talking specifically about linguistic accessibility. Language can function as a frustration and impede a child's ability to get to the analytical skills they're otherwise capable of mastering. When you provide a student with a text that's at well above their reading level, it becomes too frustrating for them to learn any of the skills we're trying to use the text to teach. So even if they would be great at understanding characterization or analyzing point of view, they can't do that if the text itself is inaccessible. And finally, engagement. And I think engagement is almost a combination of relevance and accessibility. When those two pieces come together, students are much more able to do the reading and willing to buy into the lesson that they're trying to be taught. So this brings me to the value of using young adult literature in the modern classroom. And I have a quote here from Donald R. Gallo from his articles, How Classics Create an Illiterate Society. So it makes good sense to find teachable novels whose stories are lively, interesting, enjoyable, hopefully humorous too, from which we can also learn something about how people deal with their problems, how other people interact, possibly how other cultures function, and so forth. What Gallo is arguing here is that if you're trying to teach content, if you're trying to teach skills like analysis or point of view or characterization, it makes sense to use a novel that students are actually going to read, because the students will find just as much to talk about, and they'll learn to love discussion and possibly even reading. So young adult literature can really help reduce the kinds of inequalities that are created by canonical texts in terms of language, in terms of cultural capital, etc. So to illustrate this point, I'm presenting the comparison of the first two sentences of two texts. On the left, we have the first two lines from Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. My father's family name being Purip and my Christian name being Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and came to be called Pip. On the right are the first two lines of Marcus Sedgwick's young adult novel Revolver. Even the dead tell stories. Sig looked across the cabin to where his father lay, waiting for him to speak, but his father said nothing because he was dead. So we can look at these two examples and evaluate them for engagement, relevance, and linguistic accessibility. If we start with engagement, you will notice that one of these is a much stronger hook to the modern reader than the other. The two lines from Revolver have violence, crime, mystery involved in them, and that may pull in some of the more reluctant readers in the classroom. Great Expectations, while a great novel, doesn't necessarily have the same hook to it. If we look at relevance, even though both of these texts are set in the past, Revolver being set during the Yukon Gold Rush, the text from Revolver doesn't require the same amount of cultural capital that a reading of Great Expectations would. For one, even though it's set in the past, the language is modern. And for another, it's not asking the reader to know what a Christian name is right away. So there isn't any, cultural capital to exclude the reader there. And then we can talk about linguistic accessibility. And Great Expectations has a 1230 Lexile level, which is an 11th or 12th grade reading level according to the new Common Core Aligned standards. And Revolver is at an 890, which is a middle school reading level according to the new standards. So between these two texts, the story of Revolver is going to be a lot more engaging and accessible to students. And it also happens to be a coming-of-age story, just as Great Expectations is. So it can be used to teach a lot of the same skills while being able to pull in some of those readers, or at least stop the text from being a gatekeeper. So when I taught Revolver to my Brown Summer High School class, I used the text to reach some of those standard curricular objectives that you would find. I used it to teach theme. As I mentioned before, this is a coming-of-age story, so we focused on that as a theme. We used it to teach characterization. So what are the different techniques an author uses to craft a character and show how they either change or don't change over time. And we used it to talk about structure. The novel has a lot of flashbacks in it, and it talks about how these can be used to build suspense. And before I move on, let me stop and give you a brief summary of the novel so you can understand what we did with it. Revolver is set during the Yukon Gold Rush. Its protagonist is a young boy named Sig, who, as you saw in the first 2 lines, is sitting in his cabin with his father's body. And what happens is this giant man named Wolf comes and knocks on the door and demands the gold he's owed. And Sig spends the novel sort of trying to figure out who his father really was and what had happened, to figure out how to get rid of the problem at hand. So in teaching this novel, my co-teacher and I developed 2 essential questions. The first was, how do we make decisions in difficult situations? And the second was, what does it mean to come of age? And these 2 essential questions were meant to make the text more relevant to students' lives and to help bring up those ideas of genre and theme that we would see in canonical works as well. We even discussed how being a teenager can be considered a difficult situation, and so this is sort of the constant state therein, that process of coming of age. So one of our first goals was to deal with the narrative structure of the novel, which does involve a lot of flashbacks to give background information on Sig's father and things that had happened in the past. So what we did is we had students work independently to use Post-it notes to list key events from each reading assignment, and then they would meet in groups to sort of cut down the list to the key events and arrange them into a timeline up on the board. So this is how we helped teach students to sort through the information and think about how the structure helped build suspense. To teach the concept of theme, we focused on coming of age. And what we did is start with a direct teacher presentation where students read the short story The Flowers by Alice Walker, and they walked through it together as a class to pick out some of the key features of a coming of age story. So they learned to see that shift of innocence to experience, and the fact that there seemed to be some key event that prompted the character to make that transition. And after that, we gave the students 2 key passages from the text that showed one of the secondary characters, the main character's sister's coming-of-age moment. And we had students annotate those texts and then participate in a Socratic seminar where they talked through the text and what it represented. We also used a collaborative method to teach characterization. So we did a group work exercise where students learned about characterization through description, actions, thoughts, and dialogue. And then we had them get together in groups based on the different secondary characters in the novel. And their goal in their groups was to start collecting evidence for who that character was and put together a poster, an example of which you can see here. So their poster had to show all 4 types of characterization and had to provide textual evidence of each. Where was the text showing that description or showing those actions? And they also had to add an illustration and collect some of the facts about the character's past that were popping up in those flashback chapters to sort of tie the characterization into the novel's structure. All 3 of these curricular focuses were then tested in our summative assignments. So for the final project, what students had to do was demonstrate their knowledge of characterization, coming of age, and plot structure by writing a missing chapter from the novel. They had to work backwards from their understanding of the novel to write a flashback chapter that showed how one of those secondary characters they had illustrated on posters had come of age in their past. So students really had to understand their character and all those facts they had collected about them to imagine a narrative that would explain why they had become the person they had become in the novel. So this is a sample from one of the students who wrote about the main character's mother, who is actually deceased in the present time of the novel, but shows up in many of the flashbacks. And she's a very flat character, and her biggest quality that's emphasized is her faith or religion. So this is the student's flashback chapter about the mother as a child. But before he had left, he handed me his Bible and said, "Always have faith. Even during hard times, have faith." I threw my doll on the floor, but clutched the Bible in my hand. I saw footsteps on the ground. I was now sure someone had killed them. The Bible gleamed in my face, and I remembered my father's words. It had finally hit me that faith is all I needed. Now it was my turn to teach others what my father had taught me. I think the great thing about this sample is that it answers both of those essential questions. It deals with that idea of how she made decisions in a difficult situation while she turned to the advice of her father and to the Bible. And it also answers that question of what does it mean to come of age? Because here we have the mother as a child, dependent on her father at the beginning of the scene, but turning into a teacher figure at the end by going out and spreading what her father had taught her. I also think it's interesting that this student made use of symbolism through the Bible to sort of act as a transition point. The dropping of the doll and the picking up of the Bible really symbolizes that transition from innocence to experience. So the characterization is there, matching what we knew of the mother in the book. The idea of plot structure in there, with this being a flashback chapter. And finally, the idea of coming of age is presented there in the transition she makes in this brief passage. So one of the difficulties I face in my current classroom is that I don't have a lot of choice over texts. The curriculum outlines texts that should be used, and then the book room can act as a further limitation. So instead of doing full-length young adult novels, what I've tried to do is bring in passages as mentor texts. So in this example up here is a passage from Marcello in the Real World, which is about a boy on the autism spectrum with an Asperger's-like syndrome, whose father forces him to work in the mailroom at his law office for the summer to understand the real world. And I use this passage in my classes to talk about first-person point of view and analyze why that's useful to an author and sort of prompt students into seeing that it really humanizes a character and brings us into their mind so that we can understand them better and see them as a complete person. So this is just one example of how I've used young adult texts as mentor texts to teach literary elements, even if the core text we're using isn't a young adult novel. And so some final thoughts here are that young adult passages work great as supplemental texts for teaching narrative and literary elements, and that it's also important to sort of consider expanding the curriculum by advocating for diverse authors and participating in curricular decision-making. One of the added bonuses of bringing in these passages is that it may encourage students to pick up some books outside the classroom that they might not have otherwise, and that's happened a couple times in my classroom as well. So in whatever way you can bring in these more engaging, relevant, and accessible texts, I think it's worth the effort to sort of pull them into the classroom and get kids exposure to them through a classroom setting. So thank you.